partners, and it is about ambitions of our partners and not ambitions of some bureaucrats in Brussels, as some of you might think. And whether you like it or not, you will have to tackle also the issue of propaganda. The propaganda which I already in the previous House said essentially more dangerous than than I know from the time of the Cold War. Because this one mobilises the people, this one calls for mobilisation, and this one does not stop on what yesterday was the Iron Curtain. This one spreads throughout the European continent. And point number 3, and the final point. When we have 7.5 years ago started to negotiate the association agreement, 7.5 years ago, starting the negotiation with Ukraine, from the very beginning, we have been saying that this is not a policy which will sort of put our partners into making a choice between Moscow or Brussels. No. That was our policy 7.5 years ago, and this is our policy today. The association agreement is not about making our partners make choices at the expense of the traditional ties. The association agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade area actually strengthened our partners' sovereignty. And this is the only right thing we can do, because at the end it is up to them and their ambitions to make the choice. As it is up to us also to find the most adequate and most effective reactions to their ambitions. And let me make the very final comment. No doubt about us taking Russia seriously. No doubt about considering Russia, despite Crimea, despite not stopping the flow of the heavy equipment across the border, as a strategic partner. And no doubt we are sincere when we have started with my colleague, actually, Günther Oettinger, the discussion about the price of the gas. My colleague Karel de Gucht, the trilateral discussions on the implementation of the association agreement with Ukraine and Russia. And also we are taking them seriously when addressing the number of the issues those who would like to build the South Stream to make it a EU-compatible project, and I'm talking not about politics, I'm talking about the legislations. To hold these consultations with the Russians, despite them putting us to the WTO on the third energy package. This is how we, in the best way and in practice, mean or show what we mean, that our policy do contribute to the security on the European continent. Our policy is not divisive. Our policy is a win-win, not a zero-sum game. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Füle. 7 draft resolutions have been proposed. The voting will take place on Thursday at 11, and that concludes this debate. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Good. Pasamos al siguiente.
Moving on to the next point on the agenda, and also welcoming the representative of the Commission, Commissioner de Gucht. This is the Commission declaration on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Mr. de Gucht, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me first of all say that I am particularly pleased to be here today to discuss the ongoing TTIP negotiations with the newly constituted European Parliament. You have a very serious responsibility, as it will ultimately fall to you to vote on what will have been negotiated. Your thumbs up or down will make or break TTIP. Given the wide spectrum of opinion in this Parliament, this agreement is unavoidable. But I hope the debate will be based on facts and logic, and we cannot afford to let it be controlled by irrational fears or false information. Let me focus on three themes that have been on the forefront of the criticism levied against TTIP. The alleged lack of transparency, the alleged risk of lowering of regulatory standards which underpin our way of life, and ISDS. Many people have alleged that the negotiations have been conducted so far in secrecy. It is true that when I meet my counterpart, Ambassador Froman, we prefer to do it without TV cameras being present. If you want to build confidence, you also need a certain degree of confidentiality. It is also true that the Commission historically has conducted negotiations without that much media attention, not because we wanted to keep them secret, but because the interest was much lower. TTIP has completely changed that. The Commission has worked hard to accommodate that new reality. To give one example, recently some media reported that leaked secret documents reveal that Europe is trying to get access to US oil and gas via TTIP. But that was not much of a revelation. As a matter of fact, position papers which have been available for a long time on our dedicated TTIP website clearly stated that we want the US to remove export restrictions in the energy field. Tomorrow, in the middle of the sixth negotiating round, the chief negotiators will take a break to interact directly with stakeholders. As in every single negotiating round, there will be scores of presentations from all kinds of parties with a stake in the negotiations, and they will be given direct access to the two chief negotiators for questions and answers. When each negotiation round is over, we will publish written summaries of the outcome. We have also put in place an advisory group consisting of experts carefully selected to represent a broad array of interests from civil society, including unions, consumer organisations and relevant business sectors. We have also persuaded the US to allow us to share with Member States and Parliament negotiating documents in reading rooms. But that does not mean that we cannot do even more. In fact, I wish we could, but the US only gives access to their parliament on a reading room basis. So you can imagine it is particularly difficult to convince my American counterpart to go any further with our members of parliament than they do with theirs. One of the sources of confusion is the fact that the negotiating directives given by the Council to the Commission have not been made officially public. And I am deeply convinced we should change that. The negotiation guidelines summarise the EU objectives in the negotiations and could reassure citizens that there is nothing dangerous in TTIP. In May I called on the Council to declassify them, and today I hereby call on them again to publish the negotiating directives. In addition, I will continue to be fully at your disposal to answer all questions you may have. I stand ready to consider any other specific ideas on how we can further improve transparency. One of the loudest arguments against TTIP that is often raised is that the agreement will force Europe to lower its high standards for protection of the environment, of consumers and of workers. The argument is that our European model is much better than the American one, and if we try to tear down trade barriers between the two continents, we will also automatically tear down the high European standards. Some are tempted to turn this into a Kulturkampf, claiming that TTIP threatens to Americanise our way of life. The Commission does not share this line of reasoning. First, it appears to suggest that the US is not interested in protecting the environment or its consumers or workers. Actually, sometimes the protection in the US is higher than here. To illustrate, US courts are much more likely than European ones to award high damages to consumers if they have been harmed by a product they have purchased. The air and water quality legislations in the US are not softer than ours. We do approach many areas differently than in the US, and sometimes our rules here are stricter than in the US, but we share the same objectives of quality and protection, and even where we differ, our values and concerns are more similar than with any other part of the world. That is why President Obama flatly stated in Brussels that he would not agree to any deal if it lowered the standards of protection. Neither would the Commission. Second, it is also a wrong argument as a matter of logic. There are plenty of barriers to trade that can be removed without lowering standards. Take the internal market. The internal market is low on barriers to trade and high on standards of protection. The same philosophy underpins the TTIP negotiation. We should remove protectionism, but keep protection. Does it really make sense that an inspector from the US flies over here to inspect our pharmaceutical production sites and repeat exactly the same work as was done by a European colleague? If we agree that the American inspector can stay home and just rely on a copy of the inspection report we have already made, there is no lowering of any standards anywhere. The only thing that is lowered is the amount of red tape. And where the gap in approach between the EU and the US is too wide, we just won't change our rules. We will not import any meat that is treated with hormones. We will not give a blanket approval of imports of GMOs. On the other hand, it is not because the US makes a claim that it must be wrong by definition. We should rely on the opinions of our own scientists in EFSA and not on ideology. Finally, I know that many EU citizens are afraid of including ISDS in the agreement. The fear is that this will open a way for large American corporations through arbitration to undermine policy space for our democratically elected parliaments. One often cited example is the ongoing lawsuit by Philip Morris against Australia for introducing plain packaging for cigarettes. We have suspended the negotiations with the US on this issue while we conduct a public consultation. We will draw the conclusions from it in due course. We need the debate to be about the ISS provisions we are considering to include, and not some imaginary alternative. The Commission's current ideas are available black on white in the consultation document. They have been carefully drafted to ensure that damage claims can only be raised for very clear violations of very fundamental principles of investor protection, and that the policy space is fully preserved. Contrary to what is alleged by some scaremongers, a US multinational will not be able to successfully sue for damages for lost future profit just because a parliament introduces a new law with the legitimate aim of protecting the environment or public health. The terms of this debate should not be ISDS or not ISDS. ISDS is already a feature in investment treaties between some of our member states and the US. The core question is What sort of ISDS do we want for investment protection vis-à-vis the US, but also any other third country? There will also be a question of consistency to keep in mind. I think it will be difficult one day to claim that we must avoid ISDS provisions with the US because they are dangerous, and then the next day insist to include the same kind of provisions in agreements with others, such as China. The provisions we propose in the consultation represent a very substantial improvement over most of the ISDS provisions in the 1,400 bilateral investment treaties that currently bind our member states. And I am looking forward to an engaging debate. Thank you very much.
Grazie, signor Commissario.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Prima di dare la...
Now, before I give the floor to the first speakers on the list, I'd like to remind you that in this debate, it's very important to respect your speaking times. There's at least 40 speakers on the list today, so if you fail to respect your speaking times, you'll find this session going on far beyond the predicted times. First speaker is Mr. Kaspari on behalf of the EPP.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident!
President, it's a good thing that here in Brussels we have a negotiating round. Now, our group sees TTIP as a major opportunity for companies and consumers. It's good that we have a broad debate on the topic. Here in the plenary, we've had debates in the committee and in the special working group, and we've also had a lot of debate in our societies. It's given us a chance to listen to each other and improve the flow of information. I think it's absolutely excellent that Commissioner de Gucht has provided the negotiating document. I think that it would be nice if the Council would do the same and make its negotiating mandate public. I think it's important that we should work in public, in transparency. We should see this on the Commission websites, and we should know what we're talking about here and what we're not talking about. It's about growth and jobs. It's not about reducing standards and consumer protection. It's about better market access for our companies, and it's not about forced privatization of the water system. It's a question of reducing customs on lorries, clothes and shoes. It's not about reducing workers' rights. It's about solving the problems that foreign investors often find put them at a disadvantage. It's not about trying to limit the room for political decision-making or overruling national courts. The question is how 500 Europeans can work in a global economy. How can we find democratic partners? It's not a question of getting rid of state broadcasters, national film promotion funds or regional theatres. Ladies and gentlemen, the Commission has a lot of responsibility in its hands. We do want TTIP, but we don't want it at any price. We want a TTIP that corresponds to the negotiating mandate and a resolution from May. Only under those conditions will we vote for the TTIP. In the meantime, we wish you the best of luck with the negotiations. Thank you.
Grazie, la parola onorevole Martin.
Mr. Martin is next.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner. At the start of this new Parliament, I want to lay out my group's position on TTIP as clearly as possible. We in the Socialist and Democratic Group believe that TTIP does have the potential to be a significant catalyst for jobs and growth. And we know that this could be the EU's last chance to be a setter of global standards. If we do nothing, we will be relegated from leaders to followers. It will be China, India, Brazil who will set the global standards, putting our industries at a significant disadvantage. As well as regulatory cooperation, we want to see the United States open up to European investment, its transport sector and its public procurement to level the playing field for our industries. We want to see quality European products such as Parma ham and feta cheese given strong geographical protection against generic products and misleading marketing. And we want to give our small and medium-sized enterprises the same opportunities as multinationals currently enjoy in easy access to the US market. And we do accept that this agreement could and should benefit consumers
and that is why we welcome the fact that the Commission has involved consumer groups, NGOs and trade unions in the European discussions on priorities. For all of these reasons, the Socialists were proud to be at the birth of TTIP, and we do not want to have to be its assassins. And I want to tell the Commission clearly now, though, that if we have to be, we will be. And that is why we want the Commission to listen carefully to our concerns. Like our concerns over food safety, regulatory convergence must not lead to chlorinated chickens, hormone-treated beef or GMOs getting access to the European Union market. We have had assurances from the Commission on this, but I want to tell you we will keep reminding you of this and we will keep watching you throughout the whole of the negotiations. Similarly with our concerns over investor-state dispute. We do not believe that this consultation is the end of the process. We want to ensure that the Commission listen carefully to public opinion on this issue and that ISDS does not become a backdoor route for a corporate power grab. And we have concerns about public services, and again we have had assurances from the Commission, but we want to make sure that our public services remain of the highest standard and receive the highest possible protection. We want to make sure that in this trade agreement there is no ratchet effect and there is no ability to prevent Member States returning health, education and other vital services to public control if they have been privatised. So we will keep scrutinising TTIP to make sure that the quality of our services remain high, that corporate power is not increased unnecessarily, that our high levels of protection are retained. But we have to say to the Commission, we recognise that a good TTIP would be good for Europe, and the pledge we give to the Commission and to the Member States is that we will watch the outcome of this agreement, and if we think it benefits Europe, it benefits European jobs and European standards of living, we will vote for it. If we think it damages our concerns, we will vote against it. We will make up our mind at the end. Unlike some groups, we have not made up our mind one way, and unlike other groups, we have not made up our mind the other way. We will judge this agreement on its merits at the end of the process. Thank you, President.
Onorevole Martin, c'è una...
Now, Mr. Martin, there's a blue card for you. Would you accept that blue card question?
Katrougalos.
Mr. Katrougalos.
Per 30 secondi.
You have 30 seconds.
President, my question is about ISDS. I'm quoting from the guidelines of Mr. Juncker from today's speech. I won't accept, says Mr. Juncker, that the jurisdiction of courts in the United Union member states is limited by special regimes for investor disputes. We heard another version by the Commissioner. I would like to ask Mr. Martin which of these opinions supports the opinion of Mr. Juncker or the opinion of the Commissioner.
Onorevole Martin.
I have my own position and my group has its own position, which is we do not want investor-state dispute in this agreement. And we will judge the agreement at the end of the day. But at the moment our position is very clear. We do not think ISDS belongs in such agreement because we think the normal legal system is the way to deal with these issues.
Grazie. La parola onorevole McClarkin.
The floor goes to Mrs. McClarkin for 2 minutes.
Commissioner, thank you for addressing the issue of TTIP here in the Parliament with us today. It is vital that we keep in mind just how important a deal this is for the EU. We must grasp this opportunity. A free trade deal is good for growth and jobs, but particularly one of this scale. In the long term, we can expect that it will boost the EU economy by as much as £100 billion annually, which doesn't even take into account the benefits arising from dynamic productivity gains which could, from a comprehensive deal, be realised. For the individual man or woman on both sides of the pond, they will notice that they will have more choice of products to choose from, which are of a better standard and at a cheaper price. But we must also ensure that the deal benefits businesses on both sides of the Atlantic, irrespective of size, and we can help our smallest businesses by eliminating tariffs, aligning customs processes at borders, and by increasing regulatory coherence between the EU and the US. And if we take these steps, we can aspire to one day having a truly transatlantic market. There are, of course, concerns amongst the wider European public about this deal, specifically when it comes to food standards and the investor-to-state dispute settlement. EU negotiators have ruled out the inclusion of hormone beef and chlorinated chicken, so I hope that this scaremongering will stop. And while the ISDS will be there to act as a safeguard for investors, I am pleased that the Commission has recognised concerns by launching a consultation with stakeholders on its provisions. But Commissioner de Gucht, I urge you to keep your foot on the gas, to use an American phrase, with this deal until the end of your term. It is crucial that we build momentum with this deal, and for that we need renewed political support on both sides. But at the same time, and as important as this deal is, let us remember that we must maintain and develop our existing trade relationships, which we have worked hard to build up over a number of years. We must deliver jobs and growth for our citizens and stay committed to keeping our markets open. Thank you.
There's a blue card question for you from Mr. Rubik. Would you like to respond to the blue card? Mr. Rubik has the floor.
Thank you very much. My question, well, what would this all mean for SMEs? What sort of effect, what sort of reverberations would it have? The prognosis of the Commission is that there would be growth. Would it bring growth to SMEs as well?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I do believe that there is a huge opportunity and potential for the TTIP and for an EU and US free trade agreement to deliver for all businesses of all sizes, as I say, irrespective. But we must take into consideration the impact it will have on small businesses, but we cannot undermine the opportunities that are available to them.
The next speaker is Mrs. Schaake for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, President, Commissioner and colleagues. A year and a half ago, with the necessary and heavy lifting with political leadership, we kicked off the negotiations on a comprehensive trade and investment partnership. But the days that Vice President Biden liked to talk about finishing the deal on one tank of gas seem a little bit far behind us at this moment, 1.5 years down the road. Or it seems like the Americans have chosen an exceptionally environmentally friendly car to drive in. In any case, I think they, and maybe all of us, should step on the gas to keep the very important momentum that started these negotiations. For our group, jobs and growth without government investment, but also the opportunity to set global standards and to meet competition from emerging economies, as well as lowering bureaucratic burden that's unnecessary, remain the essential points on the horizon. And we have to find ways to preserve our cherished standards when it comes to food safety and the environment, as well as fundamental rights such as the right to privacy. These are points that are raised by people all over the EU, and I think it is good to have an active debate. Transparency and active engagement are essential to acquire consent at the end of the day. So my question is, how will you help dispel the sense that quite a few people have, that there is not enough clarity on where the process of negotiation and that there may not be enough space to participate, while there can be enough space for corporations to have access? Now, the ISDS, Investor to State Dispute Settlement consultation, seems to show that there is great interest. I've heard a number of rumors about the amount of consultation submissions that were received, and perhaps you can say something about the amount of responses that came in, as well as when you expect an initial assessment or a final assessment. And do you believe that TTIP is possible from the American point of view without ISDS? Is this a negotiable point from their side? But with all these challenges, we would almost forget that there are also non-controversial issues and opportunities, such as procurement. For the EU, it's crystal clear that the US market should open up for our businesses, to end explicit protectionism through Buy American and Buy America Acts, but also implicit protectionism through national security clauses, as seen in the Jones Act, that restrict access for European shipbuilders and operators, as well as domestic flights by European airliners. Is there any progress on this point? Please inform us. Thank you.
Mr. Scholz has the floor for 1.5 minutes.
Herr Präsident, Herr Kommissar, die Kritik.
Commissioner, the criticism on this is increasingly stronger. You've seen that from the presentation that we've made here from our group. And we call for these particular negotiations not to continue. Take the time, take a little bit of thinking time off. Yesterday, we were informed that there are numerous different questions with regard to the issues, the various details of TTIP, taking into consideration, of course, the agreement that's been signed with Canada and the various drawbacks there. Perhaps the choices that have been made have not been correct. Also, ask people about their opinion on the various chapters of TTIP negotiation. Do you think that farmers and consumers want further liberalization of agricultural products? I don't think so. And I don't think that people even want that in the United States either. It doesn't represent the interest of, we need something that represents the interests of individuals, not the interests of companies, of undertakings and enterprises. So these particular issues have to be taken into consideration, particularly in view of the NSA issues. As long as the United States is not required to protect the data of European citizens, then there is no reason or there is no proper infrastructure there in place for a free trade agreement. So I think that here, indeed, we ought to interrupt any sort of negotiations which are taking place for TTIP right now. Thank you.
Mr. Jadot has the floor for 3 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Commissaire, chers collègues, depuis le début...
President, Commissioner, from the very beginning, the Green Group has denounced these negotiations because there are our society's choices that are being negotiated here. Choices about the environment, about social services, about intellectual property, agriculture, food. These choices by our societies are now being put on the negotiating table in a completely opaque environment, simply to be turning them into a merchandise to be traded. Well, they're explaining us today that this is going to be good for Europe, but no, we can see today that what Europe needs is to reinforce its own project with its own industrial policy, with its specific aspects of sustainability that we've built in. Is this an attempt to water down the European model into a broader transatlantic market? Commissioner, you've explained that the European Commission is making an effort to be transparent. Well, since yesterday, the consolidated negotiating text, that's to say, the heart of the negotiations, what's really at stake, are kept in reading rooms simply for the member states. So that's the only way you could find out. For the European Union, we've got a reading room in the European Parliament in Brussels or at the Commission. So these are our society's choices. How can we reduce these to simple consultation procedures that are carried out through these reading rooms? Well, I must say, Commissioner, this transparency is simply a facade. It's completely contradictory to the kind of democracy that Europe's citizens want. Citizens want to exercise democratic control over the European institutions. And sorry, Commissioner, but the Green Group considers that these reading rooms and the manner in which the European Parliament and the national governments are being informed about the contents of these negotiations is absolutely counter to the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, counter to Article 218(10) of this treaty. The European Parliament has the right to follow these negotiations and to be fully informed. That's the text that the European Court of Justice has already ruled upon. The European Commission needs to remember that these negotiations are illegal at the moment. And that's also why the Green Group is supporting the European Citizens Initiative that's being launched today by dozens of organizations to put an end, to call upon you as the European Commission to put an end to these negotiations and to refuse the adoption of the treaty with Canada. So on ISDS, Commissioner, I think you've heard that pretty much all of the groups that have been supporting these negotiations after the European elections are now starting to waver. I think that we should at least have a gesture to say that national jurisdictions are sufficient. There's no need to transfer democratic sovereignty of our citizens to a foreign country. I think that's what our voters told us on the 25th of May.
Thank you, Mr. Jadot. There are 2 blue cards for you. So I think we could start with the questions, then you have a minute to reply. So the first is from Mr. Kasperi, and then after that, Mrs. Yakonsari.
Sehr geehrter
Mr. Jadot, you spoke very loudly and complained about lack of transparency. Can it well be that you yourself have actually tried to call up these documents that are not supposed to be available for us? And what about the regular meetings that have taken place before and after these negotiations, and the meetings with Commission people responsible for the negotiations? You and your group weren't at those meetings.
Arvoisa puhemies, Mr. President, it is a pity that the agreement of the century has gotten such a bad reputation. The member states are responsible for member states not having defended this agreement, and the Commission and the Commission are on their own in trying to promote this. I would like to ask you, colleague Jadot, do you see anything good in this planned agreement from the point of view of growth, employment, labour rights? Do you see any positive things in it?
You have the floor for 1 minute to reply. Mr. Kasperi, well, I don't think that, but just as a Vice Chairman of the International Trade Committee and Green Coordinator on this subject, if I have access to a few negotiating documents, I don't necessarily imagine that this process is therefore transparent and democratic. But if we start discussing what's at stake here, public services, data protection, protection of health and the environment, in that case I think that our citizens, not just Yannick Jadot, MEP, I think our citizens need to be informed. And when I see these papers, these communications from the European Commission on the state of play of negotiations, you get 1 line per topic. I don't think that gives you transparent information, complete information about how the negotiations are going. I'd like to remind you that Article 218(10) of the treaty says that MEPs have to be fully informed about as for the benefits of the treaty. I can't see any, Madam. You know that the European Parliament organised a check of the Commission's assessment, and this expert check made it quite clear that it was practically impossible to have this assessment and to promise such benefits by 2027. Commissioner de Gucht himself said that the 545 euros per household, that doesn't mean anything, and the model that was used hasn't given us any assessments about the benefits or losses in terms of employment. Thank you. Now, Mrs. Begin, 2 minutes.
Signor Presidente.
Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues, citizens, as spokesperson for the Movimento 5 Stelle and the EFDD, can I put a question to the Commissioner? First of all, Commissioner, what is this? It's not just a free trade agreement with tariffs. They're already low between the US and the EU. What it is, an instrument to remove obstacles to free trade. These barriers are as follows: the rights which our workers have acquired after generations of struggle, environmental regulations, reducing pollution, food safety rules, which is what protects us from hormone beef and OGMs, dangerous chemicals, and also our privacy, protection of our personal data. That's what these rules are. Commissioner, it's been said time and again that the process is transparent and open. and the negotiations are ongoing. There are no secrets. But, Commissioner, that's no doubt the case. There are no secrets. But that's not the problem, because there are no secrets for the lobbyists or the lawyers of the big multinationals. And real access to the documents is impossible for European citizens. It's impossible for members of Parliament and for me, and I sit on the INTA committee of this House. Now let me ask once again, why is it these documents are being kept secret, a process which should have been inclusive from the very off is becoming ever more exclusive and secret and hugger-mugger. And what we're talking about here is not just the TTIP, a trade agreement, it's democracy itself. And I'm wondering, what kind of inclusive democracy does Europe want to get? Is it the same idea which inspired most of the political parties sitting around this House when they refused any chair or vice chair for members of my political group and ruled out more than 10 million citizens who had voted us into this place? President, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's not the case for their sake. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Begin, there's a blue card for you. Do you intend to answer? So I give the floor to Mr. Lambsdorff for 30 seconds.
Thank you, President. Dear colleague, I'm also in the Committee on International Trade, like you, and I look forward to our cooperation. But how do you know in advance that we are not getting documents? We haven't had a meeting in the committee yet, and the monitoring group will be making documents available as you're calling for now. Maybe you should just await the first meeting in the committee and see the documents we get before you actually make the kind of statements we just heard you say.
Mrs. Begin, 30 seconds to reply. Can you please rise?
Thank you, President. I've been here for, 2 weeks, and I've requested documents which no one has been able to give me. They've not been forthcoming. Now, no doubt we will find out further on down the path in negotiation, and I think that there are many things which we will be asking for as time goes by.
Salvini per 1 minuto e mezzo.
And the next speaker is Mr. Salvini for 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, we don't trust this. We don't really trust this. 5 years of commercial negotiations have led us to a disaster. The agreement with Pakistan has closed more than 1,000 companies. The agreement with fruit, fish and vegetables has also meant that thousands of fishermen and growers are lost. And the rice agreement that meant that this is simply not going to be on a children's table. And agreements with India, Vietnam, Korea, Colombia, India, and so on. This all means that jobs are lost, rights are lost, and the quality of life has been destroyed. And then we have the agreement with the United States. They're much cleverer than us. They are protecting themselves. They have customs. They have protection. But in Brussels, they're not protecting what we're producing in Europe. I look at my country, Italy, and we have 1 billion euros damage on wine. But the trade we have lost 3 million on oil, cheese, and false food products compared with the United States. Now, what is there in this text that will defend our situation, our tradition, our history? Nothing whatsoever. So as far as I'm concerned, this will change everything, and the Liga Nord will be voting no from the beginning to the very end. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Saifi for 1.5 minutes.
Microfono, per favor.
Could you please turn on the mic? Thank you, President, Commissioner. This free trade agreement with the United States is leading to a lot of questions. There are lots of question marks over it. So I'd like to remind you how attached we are to the different red lines, and remind you of our determination to ensure that we can carry on making our societal choices. Our farming and food models have to be protected, and our geographical indications have to be defended. And this agreement has to ensure a real access to American public procurement. including for our SMEs. And whatever you were saying about ISDS, we have to be careful that we can protect our investors, and we have to be careful so that most of our public policies in the social, environmental and health fields are not called into question by foreign multinationals. So that we don't want the ISDS to be an extra weapon in the hands of these multinationals. And in order for this not to be the case, we have to ensure that what we need is access for SMEs in a simple and low-cost fashion according to transparent procedure. And if there isn't enough guarantees on these points, then we have to ask ourselves about the maintenance of this ISDS mechanism in these negotiations which are underway. Commissioner, we've just come out of an election campaign which has been a very difficult one. Europe isn't seen as being close to its citizens, and question marks over this agreement kept coming out in debates. And as representatives of European citizens, we want these negotiations to be conducted with a firm hand, and we want there to be transparency so that we can avoid misunderstandings, and we don't want there to be political exploitation. Thank you very much. Mrs. Saifi, there's a blue card for you. Are you ready to accept it? Mr. Glezos, you have the floor for 30 seconds.
President, colleague, can I ask one point of detail? At a time when there are trading relations by all European countries with the United States, all of a sudden we have a different kind of framework suddenly being put forward. Perhaps this is the other side of the coin of NATO. Is this not a kind of trade version of NATO, masquerading as a TTIP? Thank you.
Mrs. Saifi. I don't think that this agreement is another form of NATO. The United States are an important power, the European Union is an important trade power, and I think it's entirely logical that we should be able to have closer trade ties, deeper trade ties, but we are on our guard. We have taken certain societal choices, we have red lines, and we want to see those red lines respected. And now Mr. Lange has the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. It's abundantly clear that many people are worried and disquieted by these negotiations of TTIP, and I think it's about time that we took these worries seriously and did not poo-poo them and dismiss them out of hand. First of all, we need transparency, and the fact is that this has been a very laborious process of seeing what's taking place in the context of these negotiations. I think it's unacceptable, colleagues, that Council is conspicuous by its absence yet again. That means that we cannot get publication of the negotiating mandate, a vital document, and it's for the governments to give up on this so that we can have a proper debate and so citizens can know what's being debated and negotiated on their behalf. And it's about time that the Americans gave up this a kind of protectionist approach with the NSA and everything else. They clearly are sucking in all the information, and yet when it's a document, they prevent their own negotiating documents from being let out, from being published. And people have got, I think they're having access in some kind of secret room, or a room which is not open to everyone. That's not possible. So clearly, when it comes to adult education, that's a very interesting area. What exactly do the Americans want? That's not possible. If there are negotiations, we need transparency, and we've got to know what the substance of those negotiations is, all the documents. Otherwise, one side is at a clear disadvantage. And I want to know what's being discussed and debated in the name of transparency. Sometimes, colleagues, I have the impression that with ISDS, the worries and concerns of people are very major ones on both sides of the EU. If you look at the over 100,000 submissions in the course of consultation, that I think is what that's telling us. That's the message of that. I think that we may want an agreement, but without ISDS. That, I think, is the lesson from the agreement with Australia. They had no ISDS, and so I think that we should take that seriously and say no, relinquish that, forfeit that. Investment protection, the courts are there. And my question is why there has been such inactivity here of bringing in the International Court when it comes to building up a case law on investment protection, rather than trying to get this in via trade agreements. I think that was the message for ECAN and other things which have come and gone in the past. At the end of the day, what we are doing is very rational, very conscious. I think ACTA was a lesson for all of us, and I'm sure that the Commission will take our signal this time round equally seriously. Thank you very much.
Mr. Langen, there's a blue card for you from Mr. Giegold. Are you ready to reply? Mr. Giegold has the floor for 30 seconds. Mr. Langen, thank you very much for your clear words on the topic of the ISDS. And I have a question on this clear measure, this yardstick. Is that also valid for the agreement with Canada, or with Singapore, with Vietnam, with all these agreements that also contain this investor-state dispute settlement? Do you ask there as well that this investor-state dispute settlement should not be part of those agreements either?
Well, there have been any number of surveys which tell us that ISDS is not significant for investment. Brazil, for example, doesn't have ISDS, and yet in Brazil there is a big interest in terms of investing there. And therefore this instrument is a throwback to last century and should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Thank you.
Di riprendere il dibattito, vi prego di rispettare.
Let's resume the debate. Please observe the speaking times and reduce the numbers of blue cards to the absolute essential, because we are way behind with our debate. I now give the floor to Mr. Zlotowski for a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, agreements that are concluded to enhance international trade are usually positive, but there are a number of aspects that are not clear. First of all, the negotiations are secret, and we know that the American economy is bigger and stronger than the economies of Europe. If the agreement is incorrectly designed, and since it is secret, we cannot exclude this possibility, we may come to a point where Europe will become an area of American expansion, and Europe will have less to say in the American market, because that's what happened in Poland after 1989. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a number of commercial chains, but only one is Polish. All the other chains come from Western Europe. The Americans protect their environment, but we think that we can do a better job at this. They don't think. The chairman interrupts.
No, you had an extra 20 seconds there. I had to take the floor from you.
And Americans think that they don't think that.
L'onorevole De Sarnez per 1 minuto e 30.
Mrs. De Sarnez for a minute and a half.
Onorevole De Sarnez, ha la parola.
Mrs. De Sarnez has the floor. Thank you, President. Commissioner, public opinion is invited into this debate on TTIP, and I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing because this will contribute to change certain bad habits and will get us out of this sort of discussion in smoke-filled rooms. And as you said, the ratification won't just take place here in the European Parliament, it will take place in all the national parliaments of every member state. So our democracies, not just the European democracy, but the national democracies have to be involved in this debate, and answers have to be provided to our citizens. Not to do that would be extremely negative. And what do European citizens expect? Well, they want their national governments or the European government, it's the same thing for them, they want them to defend their interests and say that they're doing that. So it's basically fairly simple. Obviously we need transparency. It's stupid that the negotiating mandate isn't public, especially as it's on the internet. We've got to allay people's fears about standards. I think we've got exceptionally good standards which protect us better than standards elsewhere, and we want to keep those, and that's an added value for Europe. It's not a minus point. And also it's a question of arbitration. We don't need an arbitration process when we have states based on the rule of law in Europe, and the rule of law works in the US as well, so you can have appeals, and we can safeguard investments through using the rule of law. So Commissioner, don't just dismiss out of hand this public debate. Public opinion are involved in this debate on TTIP, and answer their questions. Thank you very much. Mr. Léaric for a minute and a half.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. If you have nothing to fear from the reaction of the people with this TTIP transatlantic, then come away from that idea of secrecy shrouding negotiations and let the sun in. When it comes to the negotiating mandate, give us everything we need to understand in the debate here, in the unions, the member state parliaments, consumer associations, NGOs as well. Let transparency shine on all the stakeholders and players in this negotiation. You have just made a case for the International Court. But of course, it's the elected people in parliaments who make laws, not the advocates of the lawyers from the multinationals. And we refuse the situation where business takes precedence over people's rights. This is trade policy. But it's also about security of people's jobs, knowing what we're going to be eating tomorrow, health, access to education and culture, biodiversity, the production processes, our economic and social rights. In other words, a choice of civilization, no less, and the future of the European ideals themselves. Are we going to simply become a single market under the governed over by the multinationals? We're looking for answers, and we want to have this dangerous project abandoned. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mrs. Keller for a minute. Thank you very much. During the consultation on the investor-state dispute settlement, more people have participated than in any other consultation, which shows that people throughout Europe are feeling uncomfortable about private law that only favors and benefits the large companies, and we should take this discomfort seriously. When I see that the recently elected Commission President is against this kind of parallel justice system, you, Commissioner, how will you look at the ISDS, first CETA and TTIP? Will you exclude it from these agreements? That's what I would like to hear from you. Thank you. And the next speaker is Mr. Mack for a minute and a half.
Mr. Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, as a libertarian, I understand free trade as a basic manifestation of human freedom and as a precondition to prosperity and peaceful cooperation between nations. So I am in favor of free trade with the United States, able to import goods from the US without customs duties and other barriers, and our companies to be able to export to the United States, so we don't have to pay extra money each time that the goods cross borders. But such an agreement must not be as thick as this sheaf of paper. A free trade agreement, I believe, must find or must be able to squeeze within 2 pages. So I'm afraid that this treaty in the making, it will not be about free trade but about more regulation. I wish for truly free trade with the United States, but also with the Ukraine, with Israel, with Morocco, Russia, simply speaking with the rest of the world. I'm afraid that the European Commission does not want that. Customs duties bring millions of own resources for its budgets that it doesn't want to lose. I want the Commission to hear this libertarian voice for free trade. If you negotiate instead of a free trade only new restrictions, do not forget that an overregulated, there is an alternative to the overregulated approach by the EU, and that is the EFTA. That can, in the course of time, become a more attractive option for a number of states. Thank you.
Now, Mrs. Marine Le Pen for a minute and a half. Well, I've just listened to what someone said, and I've changed my view. At the beginning of this debate, Parliament, it looks pathetic. This morning you were all there, triumphant, you were crowing like cocks, as if you were capable of assuring the sun would rise on your own. But look at these fake powers. Okay, we've just elected the President of the European Commission, and you've ended up believing in this illusion. You believe that you've got power, but it's fake power. And there's this fake democratic process, which is only democratic in name. And then just a few hours later, just look at you. Just listen to what you're saying. People want transparency. People would like transparency. Will we have the right to have these documents that we're negotiating on, or will no one actually give them to us? And no one will give them to you. And all of a sudden, people are showing contempt for the Commission. And Mr. Commissioner, you're looking amused. You've got a little smile on your lips, and he's smiling when you ask for transparency. He's smiling at you. You won't get transparency because the Commission is showing contempt for you already. It's got anti-democratic procedures in the Commission, and Parliament has no powers compared to the Commission. And what's more serious is that European peoples have no power at all and no knowledge of what's being discussed, of what's happening behind their backs, and which looks more like a single market than a transatlantic free trade agreement. And these negotiations have been going on for a year, and for a year you've been groaning and moaning and asking for transparency, and you haven't received it. You didn't get it yesterday, you won't get it tomorrow. You won't get that transparency. Thank you.
Alla parola l'onorevole Winkler.
And now Mr. Winkler has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, dear Chairman. Distinguished Commissioner, very specific questions have been posed to you. I myself have 3 questions, but very simple ones. First of all, in the transatlantic relation, does status quo mean an option? No, I think in the rapidly changing global environment, standing still means falling behind. So status quo is no option. Second, does WTO multilateral trade negotiations represent an alternative? We saw Doha development round stalled and we see Bali agenda endangered. No, I think WTO negotiations are no alternative. Third, can we allow European food safety, social system, our data protection and cultural diversity to be endangered by a new provisions of the FTA? No, and I think it is the role of the European Parliament to make sure that fundamental interests of our citizens are safeguarded, and TTIP, when concluded, will equally serve all Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leichtfried, 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President. They say that well-intentioned is the opposite of good, and I think it applies here. These negotiations were no doubt well-intentioned, but they're going astray very grievously. What's gone wrong? Many colleagues have made suggestions. They talk about the investment protection clause. And let me just say, in simple language, ordinary people, when they buy a car, or a diesel, if it's cheap and it attracts less tax, then they can't go to a special court and simply complain because the government has increased the excise duty on diesel and say, well, why is that the case? This is unfair. We've been investing. We live in a democratic rule of law system, both in the US and in the UK. There's no need to do that. If investors have a problem, there are courts which are there, which exist. And I don't think that we can have special protections there for investment. Now, transparency and confidentiality. If you're negotiating with the Americans, you can't sacrifice tell everyone what your cards are, your hand is. But they, I think, tend to know what our hand is before we know what cards we've been dealt. That, I think, is the lesson from recent events. Commissioner, my impression is that this is an agreement which the big industry will benefit from and which everyone else will suffer from. That can't be right.
Intende rispondere?
There is a blue card for you. Will you answer? You have the floor, Mr. Meyer.
Präsident, ja, Herr Kollege Leichtfried, ich bin ganz begeistert.
Well, I've heard from the Social Democrat that they were full of enthusiasm a year ago when they voted in favour of negotiations in April. They also favour the ISDS agreement. I'm fascinated because what has moved you to rethink your position? Is it recent data? In Austria, I've read about you refraining from continuing negotiations. Can you tell us why your love of America has suddenly gone cold?
Onorevole, la parola per rispondere per 30 secondi.
30 seconds to respond to that blue card. Mr. Obermeyer. No, that's been the case for a long time. That's not some recent development. I've long said that of course we should start negotiations. Of course we should go through the process and then decide am I in favour or against. And now I've said, quite rightly, that things are not going well. They're going very badly, and I've suggested why I thought they were going badly. And I must say that my track record speaks for itself. I've worked for 5 years on that subject in the committee.
The next speaker is Mr. Pretzell for a minute. President, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, under the erroneous title of free trade, we're talking about TTIP, and we see through the back door was further cutbacks on the powers of national parliaments. The parliaments of Europe, we have that consumer protection, data protection, environmental protection, labour rights, and cuts on financial decisions in large groups. Does that change the political culture in Europe? You carry the responsibility from that, you people from the Commission. Can you actually assume this responsibility? Are you in position to do so? Do the peoples of Europe feel that they can be represented by you? This really belongs in the hands of the national parliaments. You do not have the necessary democratic legitimacy, and if you continue, I think you should speak out in favour of free trade between the peoples of the world, and that means that you would achieve consensus in other respects. Freedom, democracy and self-determination of European peoples should not be a part of the price we pay for free trade.
La parola all'onorevole Olli Rehn.
And now Olli Rehn has the floor for a minute and a half.
Arvoisa puhemies.
President, dear colleagues, Europe is now on the road to growth, and this growth must be enabled in all areas. We must find new ways to implement growth, even in the markets outside our union. The TTIP agreement is a central part of the European growth and employment program. It is a means to grant access for European companies on the US market. This agreement must also strongly emphasize the export dimension of European SMEs. At the same time, mutual recognition of standards may not result in the deterioration of our own legislation. The agreement cannot, for example, interfere in the parties' rights to maintain a high level of food safety and environmental protection. We must also guarantee the competitiveness of our European agriculture. The key to accepting this agreement is that we find credible answers to the concerns of our citizens. This requires openness and a functioning dialogue with the civil society. The preparedness of Commissioner de Gucht to publish the negotiating mandate is a positive step, as are the hearings by the Commission on Investment Protection, the ISDS, from the point of view of rule of law. This is the right direction. We must see the forest from the trees. That is the effect promoting growth and employment in Europe. But we must also see to it that the trees, consumer protection, countryside and the rule of law are protected.
La parola per un minuto.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Forenza, for a minute and a half. Well, it seems clear to us from the debate of this afternoon that the discussion on TTIP is really and it gives you an idea of the quality of democracy in Europe. We've now arrived at the 6th round of negotiations of TTIP, and the negotiations in real terms is actually being hidden away from citizens, hidden away from the members of this Parliament. The Commissioner himself, de Gucht, has talked about a reserved reading room. You can't take decisions that are so important, have such an impact on people's lives, and if there isn't going to be information first and then consensus. And that's one of the reasons we're saying stop to TTIP straight away. And we're asking, Commissioner, whether you feel bound by the public consultation on the ISDS, or is it just a filter to a filter of transparency? No, we want complete transparency on what's behind these negotiations. We want sovereignty when it comes to decision making, sovereignty for European peoples. But there are lots of substantive issues that with this treaty creates just one rule, the rule of the market, and you get rid of all other rules, the defence of healthy food, labour rights, privacy, agricultural standards, data privacy, and the right to health, the right to education. All those rights are destroyed, and legislation in their national parliaments on all these issues are going to be taken away from democratically elected parliaments and will be subordinate to a court, an arbitration court, and popular will is going to be subordinate to the desires of multinationals. You're talking about advantages in terms of employment. What sort of advantages are we talking about? Casual labour, labour with no rights. You're after defending the borders with Frontex, and all you're doing is building up this single market, this fortress Europe. We don't want to defend the borders. We want to defend the rights of peoples. Could you please conclude? And now, Mrs. Evans, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The TTIP was a major issue during the European election campaign. I had hundreds of messages from constituents, trade unions, campaign groups, NGOs in Wales, gravely concerned about the effects. And these could be far-reaching and damaging, as we've heard from others, in terms of public services, food quality, the environment, health and much more. Concern is growing. But in contrast to the negotiations being held behind closed doors, my group very much welcomes the European Citizens' Initiative launched publicly today by over 140 organisations in 18 member states, demanding that the negotiation mandate be repealed. One of the reasons for the disconnect between the EU and the people of Wales and elsewhere is the perceived lack of democracy and the secrecy. On TTIP, we are being kept in the dark. This citizens' initiative will enable the people's voices to be heard, and I will encourage my constituents to support it. Thank you.
Now, Mrs. Moy, for 1 minute.
Signor Presidente,
President, dear colleagues, so far we have had treaties imposed, and we have wanted a united protection of solidarity for European citizens. But those agreements have been bureaucratic. And now, in order to get so-called harmonised rules, uniform rules, we want a new treaty, TTIP, which would have the effect of taking away, of counteracting the precautionary principle, which has been protecting people's life and limb and their health for ordinary citizens. We're going to get MGO products full of antibiotics and dangerous substances. We are looking at the certificates of origin, and that's going to destroy what we have that's special and unique to Europe. Seeds, for example, with the multinationals. Again, this is going to ask questions of biodiversity which is essential for sustainable agriculture. President, to how far are you prepared to damage the rights of citizens of the multinationals who put gain before people? Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Mr. Obermeyer for a minute. Thank you, President. When we saw the opening of the sixth round of negotiations, we saw that people were asking themselves, what surprises can we not expect? We shouldn't actually give a definition to the public, but we see that reports in the EU show first of all, 92% of the negotiations are being behind closed doors, but only 4 with representatives of public interests. So if you still believe there's a panic button, well, there's food sector, for example. We are talking about 177 U.S. representatives, members of the House of Representatives, talk about that the geographic protection, for example, for Italian or Greek projects should be abandoned. And then we see that producers of quality products would be left behind. And they don't know anything, in fact, about genuine Italian Parma ham or genuine feta and so on. But, you know, all I can say is enjoy your food, Europe.
Thank you. And next, Quisthut Rovol, please.
Thank you very much, President. Honourable Commissioner, dear colleagues, I am just going to speak about the issue of investor-state dispute settlement. And even though I'm not going to make myself popular with you, I have to say that fundamentally I am not against that. Here I don't see an undermining of the state based on the rule of law. What's at stake here is a need for greater legal certainty. It's a question of uniform rules. It's a question of creating order in a morass of 1,400 different agreements. And it's not just a question of helping and giving advantages to big companies. Their investment protection would be extended to all investors, and we have to ensure that for SMEs that their investment will be protected as well. So therefore I have a question for the Commission. I'd like to know when the results of the consultation process will be published. I'd like to know what conclusions will be drawn from this consultation process. I'm not calling for the ISDS from the last century. I'm asking for a modern form of ISDS which will be transparent and which would help everyone. Final question. What are we going to do with the agreement, the CETA agreement? Do we have to renegotiate that, or are we going to stick with the status quo that we have at the moment? So, dear colleagues, a year ago, a large majority of us were in.
I would like to ask you to stop.
Auf diesem Weg allerdings mit sehr viel kritischer Begleitung. Danke.
I would like to encourage members to respect the speaking time allotted to them, because we don't have much time for this discussion. We have exceeded our speaking time by quite a bit. Next, Mrs. Mosca, 1 minute 30 seconds.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. We must at all costs avoid the TTIP agreement discussion becoming ever more ideological, and that's the danger. If we want to make progress as citizens, we've got to go through the difficult, painstaking work of looking at the real world. And we talk about transparency, we talk about involving the citizens. However, if we, at the same time, we really want Europe to have employment and growth, let us not think that this can be guaranteed just by policies internal to the European Union. Trade is the source of prosperity, jobs and growth. And let's not think that we can do anything but bear down on imbalances and disequilibria wherever they are. This is an opportunity for us with pride to export what we have done and what we've made, a social model which involves protecting people and their rights, social guarantees, sustainability, environmental and social requirements. That's what we represent, and we should make that into an export product. We have cultural specificities. We have many centres of excellence. This is our real strength. And that should be our priority in combating unfair competition and counterfeiting. We should be defending intellectual property rights and geographical origin and so on. The TTIP treaty could be a laboratory test bench. We want an agreement not at any price, but one which we've got to drive a hard bargain with TTIP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Nicholson, 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, President. First of all, I would bring to your attention it's notable that we are here in Strasbourg when in actual fact negotiations will take place this week in Brussels, but maybe that's our fault. I in principle am supportive of an agreement. However, negotiators on both sides must recognise the significant and valuable role of the European Parliament. MEPs are the most direct and discreet form of public consultation. Our constituents are the ones who are set to experience the benefits or costs of an agreement, so it is extremely important that we as their representatives are meaningfully involved. From an agriculture perspective, we must adopt a dual approach which recognises both opportunities and challenges of the greater market access. Our founding principle will be that TTIP must not undermine EU standards nor compromise local industries. Freer trade for beef is a prime example of the necessary balance that is required. Hormone-fed beef must not become the norm for our farmers who are already under enormous pressure in the market. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Lambsdorff.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. This debate demonstrates that we need a strong democratic centre in this House. Mrs. Le Pen makes us look ridiculous. It depends, she thinks that she gives very easy answers to difficult countries. I have seen this for 30 years in my country, and I think it's a worrying approach. And the GUE, we have communists who call for transparency, but whether they have transparency or not, then Ms. Ricker said they want to interrupt the negotiations. So it's not about transparency, it's simply about removing the agreement, no matter what it contains. There's a campaign and from the right and the left. But what we want new jobs, we want growth in Europe. How do jobs come up in Europe? Well, through research and innovation, because new products or new services are being introduced, or because new markets are being opened up. We tried to get into the Airbus into the defense market in the United States. And the food industry, as has been mentioned, well, we are a very strong continent on food. But we have more than 100% tax rates, customs rates against European cheese. Let's remove these tariffs. And what about shoes? We see frustrated consumers who are paying hundreds of euros of customs on shoes. And we see the leather industry in Italy and the shoe industry there, well, it's suffering. But, I think we must be in favour of jobs and growth in Europe. And let's not forget, at the end of the day, we decide with a broad democracy, a democratic majority in this House. Thank you very much.
Next, Lambsdorff, you have a blue card question. Are you ready to accept it? It comes from Lamberts. Please.
Thank you. Let me break a lance for the GUE. Because even today, there are those who think that the TTIP draft is not good. It's not because of fundamentalism. It's because we know perfectly well what the objective of the treaty is. We talk about 0.5% growth extra. Now, I come from business, and my habit is to have a cost-benefit analysis. The benefit, we don't know if it exists, but the question is who's going to pay for it in terms of reducing environmental standards, social standards, health standards. Who's going to be paying when it comes to reducing democratic standards? The problem with the European Parliament is not just because it's not consulted, But if you have the principle of mutual recognition of standards, we can close this place up. We can shut up shop. And we'll let the American multinationals do the stuff, do the biz, instead of us.
Dear Mr. Lambert, I think we're not talking about overall recognition of standards, but when we're talking about standards, for example, for cars, it would make things a lot easier. That would be a huge help in this situation. Also, the reduction of bureaucracy, tariffs, and test procedures in Europe, and so we don't have to do everything twice over. When we're talking about public procurement and open that to both sides, we see Microsoft and software running on IBM or Dell computers. In the America we see the same, but we in Europe have lots of products which would be available for both sides, and it would be very good for the European automobile industry because our cars are better than the Americans. Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. Carthy, please. 1 minute.
The transatlantic trade and investment partnership has the potential to damage our environment, devastate the rights of workers, producers and consumers. One of my primary concerns is for the agricultural sector in countries like Ireland. It's clear at this stage already that the unique standards and production systems that apply on Irish family farms, for example, are to be compromised in negotiations, and Irish farmers are rightly demanding that their livelihoods and their communities are protected. One of the reasons why Sinn Féin rejected the Lisbon Treaty was because of the loss of Ireland's veto on such matters. So there is a responsibility on the Irish Government and on MEPs who sit in this chamber who campaigned in favour of the Lisbon Treaty in Ireland on the promise that it would create jobs, to stand with Sinn Féin and progressive voices across the European Union in opposition to the TTIP. And the European Commission must hear this message today. We will not allow the sellout of Irish and European farmers for the sake of what's a bad deal for everyone else.
The next speaker is Mr. Bütikofer, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Commissioner de Gucht, I'd like to ask about this issue of transparency, and just like for you in the Commission so far regularly, when it comes to this demand for more transparency, you've always acted in a complacent fashion, even with contempt, almost to condescension. And in your introduction you just talked about your nationality and false information and how you wanted to correct that. But can you understand that there is justified criticism? I'd like to point out that the new President of the Commission has promised that when it comes to transparency there will be a new beginning, and what we've had so far is not sufficient. I'm not a member of INTE, I'm a member of the US delegation, I'm a member of the Transatlantic Legislative Dialogue, and I can't go to room 4C18 in Brussels and have a look at these documents, and Mr. Jadot has been there. I can't even ask him what he's seen. That's not enough. It's not sufficient. We need full access to all decisive negotiating documents and NGOs as well, and civil society needs the same access that the industrial lobbies have had for a long time already.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Ferrand, 1 minute.
Monsieur le Président. President, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to speak on the agricultural side of the TTIP. This week sees the beginning of round 6 in this treaty, and we must admit that we are concerned at the way the negotiations are going, particularly on geographical indications. I am from Bourgogne. I defend Moutarde de Dijon and the Meursault, Chablis, Pliny-Marchais, all of those fine wines. You have to give us your support for the Camembert and Foie Gras in France, because these are quality labels. You have to show solidarity for European colleagues, whether it's Gouda, Parma ham or beer brewed in Belgium. Now, I haven't got time to list all of the fine products produced in the continent of Europe. Now, the Americans, they deny Europeans the right to protect their local products by means of geographical indications, because of commercial considerations which level everything down now. And we have a duty to our peoples to protect our way of life, the way we live in Europe and in France. It's important for the Commission and the Parliament to oppose vigorously the American diktat.
Next, Mr. Köstinger, 1 minute.
President, Commissioner, I would also refer to the letter from the American senators written to Mr. Wilczek, where there's a call for an aggressive approach to these protected geographical indications in Europe, and they are part and parcel of our union. Of course, they also create great value for us. They consider them as trade barriers and should therefore be removed. I'd also refer to the fact that together with my EPP colleagues from 15 different member states have called upon you already to act against that. We are not prepared to vote in favor of an agreement which would do harm to the agriculture of Europe as we know it and esteem it. And also the question of food safety is a sensitive issue. And there we're talking about the producers in Europe. Against them we have a huge agricultural industry, and it's not in the interest of us or the consumers because we are not willing to give up our high European standards.
Maurel.
Next, Mr. Morel, 1.5 minutes.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
President, dear colleagues, having listened to the Commission, I sometimes have the impression that everything is going fine in the best of possible worlds. We can sleep peacefully, we're going to prepare a radiant future for you. The problem, Commissioner, is that many elected members, but also millions of our fellow citizens, don't share that point of view. They have doubts about the appropriateness, the usefulness of this transatlantic treatment, about the need for it, and they have doubts about whether this generalised approach to free trade will, at the end of the day, actually promote growth and employment. They have their doubts, and you have assessments which are very uncertain. You are saying that by 2020 everything will be fantastic, but the benefits that you are proposing seem rather hypothetical in nature. By contrast, the risks, and everyone has said that from all quarters, the risks are major. The risks for labour law, risks for social standards, risks for our environmental standards, risk for our health standards, and frankly, dear colleagues, when I hear you, and I'm a new boy here, and if you add up all these risks, and then you wonder whether it's really worth the candle. And I can have my fears allayed on 2 points from everything I've heard. First of all, the secrecy of these negotiations is unacceptable to all of you, and I'm pleased because we're a democratic parliament. And second point, it's not possible that we accept any longer a mechanism which runs counter to European law and runs counter to our rules. I'm talking about ISDS.
Next, Mr. Kuzmiuk, 1 minute, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. From the point of view of the European Union as a whole, and from the point of view of Poland, one of the most important issues that need to be negotiated is the waiver of license restrictions and free trade in gas between the US and Europe, as it is the case with other countries that have an agreement with the US. In 2013, the US price for gas was 3 times lower than in the European Union, which would mean that energy-intensive plants would be transferred to the United States, and as a result, a number of jobs would be lost. It is also important from the point of view of Europe and Poland is the liberalization of trade in agricultural and food products, including GMOs and meat with growth hormones. This will probably not be able to eliminate these problems from the agreement, and therefore such foods will have to be labeled properly. Otherwise, our food healthy European food will be eliminated from the market, and this would mean problems for the European agriculture.
The next speaker is Mrs. Sharantsova, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you for the work you have done. We all know what is at stake. If we reach agreement with the US, we will create the biggest free trade zone on the globe, and we will be in a better position to compete with other players, particularly from Asia. However, there is more to it. Our economic growth is sluggish while unemployment runs high. If negotiated well, this agreement is an opportunity to deal with the problems. It is your task, Commissioner, to negotiate an agreement which will remove obstacles for our businesses, protect their interests, boost innovation, while, and it is very important, it will not lower our quality standards and consumer protection. And yet another important task for you, Mr. Commissioner. Our citizens do not understand the negotiations. They fear the negotiations. That is why we need to increase transparency and change the communication strategy. The transatlantic partnership will be a success story only if we win the support of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Senra Rodriguez. 1 minute, please.
Yes. Thank you. Well, after this debate that we've been holding here, it seems to me that if this TTIP was of such interest for European citizens, then the Commissioner and the Commission wouldn't have any doubts for a moment about publishing all documents relating to the treaty. But however, they're not doing that because, firstly, they know full well that this treaty is going to mean more precarious jobs, more casual labour. They know that this treaty is going to lead to the privatisation of public services, basic social services like the health service or education, and not just privatisation, it's also going to make irreversible this process of privatisation. And thirdly, they know full well that this is going to mean the ruin of farmers, of small farmers, and those who are smallholders in Europe. Their life will be over, and you know full well it's going to mean the end of the precautionary principle, and they know full well that this will also mean handing over the sovereignty of our peoples to multinational companies.
Tack. Nästa talare herr Balczko. 1 minut. Varsågod.
Elnök úr, köszönöm a szót. Ez az
President, thank you for giving me the floor. This agreement, the free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States of America, is very well packaged. The packaging is very good on the outside. However, I don't think that at heart it's intended to do anything other than serve the interests of big multinationals vis-à-vis governments. In particular, American companies, they are now going to be able to take proceedings against European companies with private settlement courts in the United States. When it comes to, I think that this is a major danger with the possibility of GMOs being allowed into the European Union. It's counter to the sovereignty of member states and is also bad for the interests of the citizens. We should not vote in favour.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, President. Commissioner. To Katowice, to a European Economic Congress, I have invited the main negotiators on the part of the EU, on the part of the US, and I would like to thank Commissioner de Gucht for supporting us. We have specific conclusions. We know what entrepreneurs want, small ones, big ones. They want the free trade of energy. That is a way of creating jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. Secondly, if we think of reindustrialization, we have to remember about compensating mechanisms for the emission of CO2 for key sectors of our economy. Both sides of the Atlantic should approach it in the same way. Cooperation in terms of innovation and creating new standards. And our last point, we are creating, opening our market to the US, so we should be strong. We should have a common telecommunications market. This is a conclusion of what European entrepreneurs had to say in Katowice.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Rodriguez Pinheiro Fernandez, 1.5 minutes. Please, you have the floor.
Señor comisario, creo que este acuerdo, y después de escuchar a todos mis colegas, necesita más que nunca mucha pedagogía y mucha transparencia. Pedagogía para incidir en que Europa necesita crecer y crecer en base a ser más competitivos, creando empleos de calidad con salarios dignos, que son los que precisamente defendemos en el Estado del bienestar que apoyamos. Y por eso creo que es importante.
And in order for this to be achieved, I think it's important to support this agreement. It's a trade and investment agreement with the United States. We need this in order to ensure that we have a greater ability to grow. But this agreement cannot be kept secret. As a socialist, I cannot defend an agreement which is going to bring down European standards in social terms, in labour law standards and environmental standards, but also I can't accept an agreement which would not guarantee a solid protection of private personal data and also the respect for our different cultures in the European Union. We don't want that to be undermined. And also, we also need an agreement which will cover regulation of financial markets. We shouldn't forget where we are now because of the lack of the regulation of financial markets. And I'd also wanted to say that it's crucial to have transparency. You said before that they can't offer colleagues, the US negotiators can't offer MEPs about the same information that they are making available to North American congressmen and congresswomen. I don't know what North American Congress people accept, but it's clear, it's obvious that we as MEPs cannot support an agreement if we don't have the necessary information in order to get a good basis in order for assessing it so that we can see what the conditions of this agreement are going to be. So we need progress in this area.
Thank you. Next speaker, Madam Swinburne, please. 1 minute.
Mr. President, we should not underestimate what a huge achievement a free pact with the US would be. The benefits to the EU economy are conservatively measured in the billions, and this is a practical step we can take to achieve real economic recovery. Although investor-state dispute resolution and transparency are genuine issues, they are solvable and should not be used as an excuse for protectionism. The best way to get the global economy moving again is via increased capital flows with appropriate financial supervision and regulation that avoids loopholes between jurisdictions. 95% of derivative trades and 80% of all financial transactions happen between the EU and the US. We finally have high-level agreements that our legislation on both sides of the Atlantic should achieve the same outcomes, yet barriers remain. TTIP should provide a framework for both the US and the EU to meet and solve remaining areas of contention, even outside of the formal trade agreement. The political will is already there to work together. It is now up to both American and EU politicians and regulators to show that they are able to achieve tangible results that really do break down barriers to move capital as well as goods and services both sides.
Merci. Madame Ries, 1 minute, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Well, just a minute. I hope that I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to come back on this in greater depth. I note the health, social, other protections, listening to the Commission, that those are going to be protected and vouchsafed, and that makes good news. So no chlorinated chickens. We're vigilant. We will take you at your word, and we'll make sure that you deliver the goods. Now, there are many question marks over the negotiations. You've said it's going to be a long time before we can draw all the lessons, learn all the lessons. But given the ammunition here, given the explosive subject, should we not just trust our legal system which works perfectly well. And more fundamentally, there's a danger of a divorce from public opinion. Does the Commission realise that you're losing this battle for people's hearts and minds in certain member states? I note that the ministers concerned are being quiet in all languages, and that's where the blockage lies. It's not a technical thing, it's the citizens. And you have to defend their interests. It's not just a priority, it's a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Fru Björk, varsågod.
Thank you. Över 100 möten med
more than 100 meetings with lobbyists, but only a handful with the representatives of consumers and the environment. That shows where these negotiations are going. It's not about trade with shoes or bicycles or whatever, but it's simply about what kind of society we want to live in and what democratic principles we want to see implied. The TTIP is a threat against labour rights, public health and the environment. And the large corporations are clapping their hands in this race to the bottom, the harmonization to the lowest possible level, which is what we see from the recent documents. And the large companies will be enjoying even more power, and it means that they can't accept, for example, that there are countries that would prevent them from profits. It's not just us from Sweden who are against it. The people of Europe will never accept this kind of trade agreement because we cannot have a compromise on democracy.
Herr Milan Mon, 1 minut, varsågod.
Gracias.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks for the information you have provided on the negotiations of this agreement. Unfortunately, through the chief negotiator, Mr. Garcia Bercero, in this Parliament and in the last Parliament, we've been kept informed on a regular basis about the negotiation process, and the agreement with the United States is ambitious and balanced, and it will be mutually beneficial, and it will be very important for growth and employment, which we all very much need. And the conclusion of this agreement, according to all the surveys, will contribute to economic prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic, and it will also help to breathe new life into the relations between two strategic allies, especially also moving us closer to the Pacific. We need to find satisfactory solutions with the United States when it comes to data protection and on telecommunications. This is a delicate issue, and it might have a negative impact if we don't resolve those problems in this agreement. And secondly, the agreement has a very positive aspect. It will open up the idea of a big triangular economic space, which will involve Latin American partners as well, and who have close ties with the US and with Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci. Madame Arena, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Alors, je ne ferai que...
President, just to repeat, Mr. de Gucht, what you said about the bags you'll be taking with you, and which will determine whether we'll be able to support the process leading to the TTIP. First of all, transparency. We've talked about transparency, negotiations, which are not confined to simply saying that 5,000 pages of the dossiers are going to be in a reading room somewhere. What it means is that you can make it understandable to everyone. And then secondly, the different standards. And particularly, these are guarantees to the member states so that we can have regulations where they defend legitimate interests of citizens. And then thirdly, ruling out the ISDS. Absolutely. Fourthly, defending public services and excluding the cultural sectors. Mr. Juncker this morning told us how strong his support was for those points, the ones which had been the milestones for the socialists. And I hope, Commissioner, that the 3 months which at the end of this Commission will be sufficient to rectify the course, change tack, because so far we've had no guarantees on these points, and that's what we're looking for from the Commission. Thank you.
The next speaker is Ferreira, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. This free trade agreement between the EU and the United States is one of those topics where you see where the dividing lines are clearly. There are dividing lines between champions of regulated trade based on complementarity, on the other, the champions of deregulated trade based on competition between countries, producers and products. On the one hand, you have those who are champions of primacy, of public interest, in respect for economic, social and labour rights, and on the other hand, defendants of profit for multinationals and this race to the bottom when it comes to our rights and the devaluation of labour forces. And then on the one hand, you have champions of environmental sustainability and maintaining public health, and on the other hand, you have those who are in favour of giving up our precautionary principle just in order to get new markets. And then another dividing line between those who defend public services, which are an inviolable achievement of civilization, and on the other hand, you have those people who just want to see the state being the market being like a steamroller running over the social roles of the state. And then there's a confrontation between those who defend the right to development and the right to produce, and on the other hand, those who defend the protectionism of the rich.
Edustaja Sayer, 1 minuutti.
Next, Sayer, 1 minute.
Tartozom azok közé, akik valamit ismeretlenül már eleve ellenez.
Thank you very much, President. I'm not against something which I do not know about, but I would like to say a word about the preconditions which must be taken into consideration. The stated purpose is to improve employment, and it's got to bring benefits also to small and medium enterprises, so that European companies are also able to be competitive. We must reduce the price of energy. With the current energy bills, energy prices, that's not possible. If we can't bring energy prices down, then I think we've got to do what we did in Hungary, whereby the member states and the EU have got to do something. That's what we've done with roaming. For example, we cannot imperil the health of citizens. GMOs and chlorinated chickens are unacceptable. It's important for the European Parliament to be informed. This must not just be transatlantic. It must be transparency. Otherwise, we will not be able to support this. Thank you very much.
Curtin Darling, 1:30, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman and Commissioner de Gucht. Recent Pew Research Centre work on public opinion on the TTIP shows that while people on both sides of the Atlantic don't yet fully oppose the trade deals, they generally don't expect to get more jobs, higher wages or lower prices out of them. That being the case, what should you be doing to convince them that they'll actually benefit from the TTIP? It feels like we've forgotten our history. Working people in my home country only supported and continue to support the European Union's internal market because it comes attached to a social model. And public services are a key pillar of that social model. Last week, the EU chief negotiator wrote to allay the UK public's fears about the use of the TTIP to lock in the current UK government's backdoor privatisation of our National Health Service. Now, we're not naive in the Labour Party or in the UK. We know that the biggest threat to our NHS is the Tories and not the TTIP. But the British people do not want to see a narrow exemption only for it to become subject to privatisation creep in the years to come. What more can you do to reassure public sector users and workers that TTIP will prevent further privatisation or liberalisation of our public services? Since Trust Me hasn't worked so far, will you commit to a public consultation on how we can protect our public services? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Monsieur Prost, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, I'm not sure what's more serious, the rumours being bandied about or the debate among citizens. Commissioner, let me ask you this question. Do you respect the negotiating mandate which you were given? I hope that you'll demonstrate today that you have not exceeded the negotiating mandate, for example, in agriculture, which is a persistent rumour one hears. Do you have the confidence of the other commissioners on this subject? Let's not forget here who we are. the leading trade power worldwide, let's remain credible, is by our strength that we can impose our limitations. For example, what's the cost of the whole negotiating process? Your mandate is coming to an end. Do not make the mistake of opening up all the different areas of liberalisation. Otherwise, your name will be associated with the failure of a major treaty with the Americans. Transparency, firmness, protecting companies and citizens. Those are the watchwords. They must be anchored in all of those who are around that negotiating table. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Silva Pereira, 1.5 minutes, please.
President, Commissioner, dear colleagues, the TTIP is a strategic partnership, really, and it's a major opportunity for the European economy. But what's at stake here is not just an ambitious trade agreement between the two biggest world economies, but also what's at stake is a big movement of regulatory convergence, which will have a big impact on the world of trade, and it will lead to greater regulation of globalization. If the TTIP does look after the interests of the European Union properly and of its member states, then it can bring many advantages for our economies. The European Parliament has already given its support to the holding of these negotiations and has also asked for the defence of European values, the safeguarding of social, labour and environmental standards. And it's important the Commission takes very seriously the positions of Parliament. Parliament does have the powers for the final approval, the final consent to this agreement. 2 points, finally. The first one, Commissioner, it's necessary to get the support of public opinion behind this agreement, and it's only transparency that will allow us to increase confidence. So what's been done so far isn't enough. So what initiatives is the Commission going to take in order to strengthen transparency in the negotiations of TTIP? And the second point concerns financial services. We know that there's a resistance on the American side over this, and we'd like to know whether the Commission is able to guarantee.
The next speaker is Mr. Chico. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Well, if this moment the interventions we've heard, we should assess the situation. I think that we can say there's no contribution that's been given in the direction that is intended to aimed at protecting everything that's been mentioned. We can see a disaster without a clear objective. Force Europe, and we see that the conditions of Europe are not so important there. But I hope it's not so, President. I hope, on the contrary, that we can work for the objective, because we want to safeguard the economic situation in the company, in Europe, the central SMEs. And we wanted to see the standards that give advantages not just to the regulating states, but just the multinational companies. They shouldn't just have the profits, but we want to see advantages, and the transparency we're calling for should be guaranteed. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mrs. Jongerius, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, the United States are our biggest ally. They're our biggest allies. And the EU's the biggest economy. And because of that, a trade agreement with the Americans brings many benefits with it. However, those advantages cannot be at any cost. It must not be to the disadvantage of Europe. It's got to be to the benefit of European citizens as well, and not just a few investment companies or bankers or big multinationals, because then we'll never regain the confidence of all the citizens who stayed away from on election day here only recently. The TTIP has got to have something for metal workers, or for the many young people who are sitting at home because they haven't got a job. If it's going to lead anywhere, then it's got to lead to more jobs. It's got to lead to jobs, 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 because that is the bottom line. What we cannot import with this is all of the things which we disapprove of. We need decent salaries, decent wages, with proper protections against dismissal, so that people don't have to have a second job or a third job in order to make ends meet. At the end of the day, I want a transatlantic agreement, but not, as I say, at any cost. Thank you.
Seuraava puhuja, edustaja Landsbergis.
Thank you. Time is up. The next speaker is Landsbergis, 1 minute.
Dear President, Mr. Commissioner, thank you. Crimean occupation and continued aggression in eastern Ukraine has more than ever displayed the need for even deeper and more integrated cooperation, not only between European countries, but between EU and the US as well. I'm sure that all of us would agree that the free trade agreement not only boosts economic growth and creation of new jobs, but at this time it can be regarded as a means for ensuring geopolitical stability and peace in Europe. That is why we have to ensure relevant political attention and the negotiations with us that wouldn't stall and move forward. Even more so, one can observe how, as if by chance, at every step of the negotiations between the EU and US, some damaging information appears. One can start suspecting that someone is interested in stopping the process as early as possible. That is one more reason why we have to keep pushing forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seuraava puhuja,
The next speaker is Mr. Danti, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. The ongoing negotiations with the United States to set up a free trade area across the Atlantic gives great opportunities of greater economic integration, freedom of trade, freedom of the exchange of services and so on, which gives good opportunities for business, and it would certainly stimulate productivity and also help us for the exit of the financial crisis and improve the situation in Europe. But the negotiations should mean that we have a balanced outcome, because the production in Europe is looking for new markets, but we cannot sacrifice the quality which is typical of the Made in Europe, and nor our social systems. So the defense of our food standards and the protection of, for example, the system geographic indications and quality marks and so on is essential for us to ensure that the TTIP will be a benefit for Europe or something that we just lose. Well, we want to be able to guarantee the citizens that we reserve the precautionary principle, and we must also be able to sustain the production system in Europe so that we can see that they can also find a way out of the crisis, and so that we have food production in Europe of high quality.
Thank you. TTIP represents unquestionable geopolitical benefits. However, it is predominantly a trade agreement, and therefore it must be economically beneficial to EU companies. Companies that invest and produce in Europe, hire European workers and pay taxes in Europe. The reality is we have very high regulatory costs, thanks to ETS, REACH and the like. Much higher electricity prices, very high gas price, and now we will remove all duties on imports from the US, where the gas is a quarter of our price, electricity is 1/2. How are we to compete with this? Just to be clear, I'm in favour of this partnership, but we need the European Commission to negotiate a beneficial deal that will address the higher costs of regulatory compliance in the EU and does not put in danger EU industries that create hundreds of thousands of jobs and pay millions of euros in taxes every year. Thank you.
Monsieur Andrieu, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Andrieu. Yes.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Repetition is the best way to learn, and we've got to get a good TTIP. It's got to be transparent and genuinely transparent, diaphanous in fact. in the best interests of citizens, social partners. They've all got to be involved and in the loop. And with the Socialists, we want the extensive publication of exchanges after every round of negotiations. We want scrupulous respect for all legislation and collective preference, which makes up our European social model. All the agreements must be conducive to high levels of protection and standards, food safety, labour protection, fundamental rights. We must defend our public services and cultural products as well. And when it comes to the dispute settlement, ISDS, we've got to be careful there. We, of course, have got a timetable, but we must make sure that our geographical descriptions are protected and that our farmers are given the necessary protections. No hormones, no chlorinated chickens, and such like. Thank you.
The next speaker is Zalba Bidegain. Please, you have the floor. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. The majority of us have been supporting throughout the election campaign the creation of jobs. We've all been calling for that during the election campaign. So it's surprising that those who have most emphatically during the campaign been calling for protection of jobs and creation of jobs, those are the ones who seem to be the loudest in complaining about this agreement with the United States. And this agreement with the United States is the tool for giving a fillip to growth and creation of jobs. So the GDP of the European Union could be 1.5% higher because of this agreement, and more than 2 million jobs could be created in the European Union because of this agreement. That's about 43,000 of these could be created in Spain, in my country. So I'm surprised that some of the ladies and gentlemen are attacking with such vehemence this agreement. And this is an agreement, obviously, where the SMEs need to be benefiting the most. They must benefit from it the most. So finally, Commissioner, I'd like to remind you of the importance of including financial services in the negotiation of this agreement. Thank you very much.
Köszönöm szépen. Következő hozzászólónk Gephardt asszony lenne, sajnos nem látom a teremben. Így megadom a...
Thank you. Next, Mrs. Gephardt. I cannot see her, therefore I will give the floor to Mr. Elmar Brok. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Brok.
Meine Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner, President, I think that the TTIP agreement is very significant because there's a political mission. It strengthens the links between Europe and America, the big powers where we sharing a great deal of values. Therefore, we will benefit also community. We will see the creation of jobs, greater competitiveness, and it means that protectionism has always destroyed jobs, whereas free trade has created jobs. And when I see what the left and the communists say, talking about standards, well, we have never seen that complied with in any country where they have been in power. On the contrary. But I think that we shouldn't therefore get excited. I think we will see that there are standards we don't even negotiate. For example, consumer protection and European standards, there's nothing against it because the Parliament has in fact dealt with these issues. We're not talking about dispute settlement. You know, nothing of this kind is involved. Well, we can, for example, prevent child labour throughout the world if the standards if this can be maintained by the United States. Therefore, I think, generally, we can say we become more competitive. We will be protecting our jobs, and this is what we need. We don't want to see protectionists. I don't want to see any kind of association of that kind. Because I think we want to I don't want to see anything destroying the interests of Europe or our jobs. And if I can just make a comment, it will mean that we should try not to turn this into a mixed agreement, but an agreement which is limited to a particular area that can be adopted in this House and also go through the 28 parliaments. Maybe we should reconsider that. But this campaign in the social services and so on should not be carried on.
Köszönjük képviselő úr hozzászólását, közben megérkezett Gephardt asszony. Gephardt asszony, önné a szó.
Thank you very much, now Mrs. Gebhardt. President, I think this is a very important topic that we're discussing today, and I think we have to consider very carefully, and I have a slightly different view to the previous speaker. In the European Union, we have a basic principle that's very important, and that is the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle in the areas of farming, in the area of consumer protection, is of great importance. And this is one of the issues where we have a difference of views with the United States, and they're demanding of us that we actually give up this principle, and we can't just accept that. We can't take it lying down. Yes, we need trade with the United States, but not at any price, not any sort of trade. And we take Mr. Juncker at his word, who said very clearly today that we won't agree to any old agreement. We want to ensure that it is a reasonable agreement. If it's not a reasonable agreement, if consumer protection, if environmental protection, if data confidentiality protection and other important issues are called into question, are in jeopardy, then we can't agree. And therefore I say very clearly, we have to guarantee that here we look very carefully at what's in these texts, and we have to ensure that the best is achieved for our citizens. Thank you very much.
Köszönjük, képviselő asszony. Ön egy kék kártyát kapott.
Thank you very much. And there's a blue card. Are you ready to accept it?
Card. Do you accept it? Yes. Rübig úr, öné a kérdés.
Are you accepting the blue card?
Ja, Frau Kollegin Gebhardt, ich möchte Sie fragen.
Mrs. Gebhardt, dear colleague, do you see any advantages in the TTIP agreement, particularly when it comes to workers? Can you see any advantages at all, or is it all gloom?
At the moment, I can't see either advantages or disadvantages because I don't know the text yet. And as I haven't seen the text, I can't say what's in there, and I can't say how I would assess it. And I say one thing very clearly: a text in which there are disadvantages for labour law, for social rights, were there to be anything like that in such a text, then I couldn't agree to it, and my group wouldn't be able to either.
Köszönjük, képviselő asszony. Következő hozzászólunk.
Thank you. And now Mr. Peter Liese has the floor.
Frau Präsidentin. Thank you, President. Colleagues, it's good, as Elmar Brok said, if the EU and America, as great democracies, work together. And it's also the good if we can dispose of unnecessary bureaucracy. As coordinator for the EPP group in the Environment Committee, I have to be concerned about our standards and making sure they prevail. And in the food area, there is much criticism in the discussion. I'm disappointed, Commissioner, that despite the proposal from the responsible Commissioner and the recommendations from the European Parliament, in chlorinated meat, in labelling, we wanted labelling in there when it comes to chlorinated chickens. We wanted to get that, and we haven't got it. If you talk to the expert, to their people, they say, well, it's an information thing, and it's simply educating citizens. But we've got to be serious. We were not elected to this House to tell people outside that we know better than them. I think that we'd be more credible in defending the agreements if we could say precisely what it involves, what it contains, and we've got to really sell it on its strengths. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hübner has the floor.
Please, micro.
President, Commissioner, while we should certainly look at the TTIP from the point of view of the economic opportunities it will generate, it is also clear that its public perception matters strongly. And TTIP will be attracting a growing amount of public attention, and legitimate anxieties linked to it will have to be addressed. But we must not see TTIP as a simple sum of individual stakeholder interests. It is an unprecedented strategic deal between the largest economies and democracies of the world, with robust welfare growth and jobs consequences for the transatlantic citizen. It is a deal with significant global relevance. And the challenge is that while benefits from the deal will be more mid to long term, the confidence of the citizens needs to be earned today. And this is also our responsibility in this House. It is up to us in the European Parliament to reflect on how the critical mass of the benefits can be measured, and it is also up to us in the European Parliament to contribute in a constructive way to the final judgment of its value added. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Andreas Schwab has the floor.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Throughout the debate, I thought that perhaps nobody has really understood that the election campaign is over. Mr. Kuipik and Winkler said very clearly that there's a decision here which affects the member states, our 28 member states, and they support them. They wanted to see these negotiations for TTIP on the background that the globalization will be even stronger in future in Europe, and we will only be strong if we really get in the right position. That's why we're negotiating, and this is the right objective. Whether there are points that we may or may not like in these negotiations, we must take into account the concerns of the citizens. But of course, we have started negotiating, and therefore we think we can reach a good conclusion in Europe. We're able to see a turn, and the world is not standing still around us, and otherwise we will simply miss the train. And we work in the interest of the citizens and the workers and the consumers, and if we approach this correctly, we're talking about the bit of PR as well. I think that we can get the citizens to support this agreement. Therefore, Commissioner, I think you should make sure you communicate correctly.
Thank you. Mrs. McGuinness.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, this is a work in progress, but as you can hear from the range of views in this House, we are very vigilant on the possible outcome. Truthfully, I would like to have heard a little bit more about another deal, which is the Canadian deal, which I understand is still being negotiated, and perhaps you might give us a short update as to what is happening there. I have a specific issue around beef, which I think you are aware of, Commissioner, and it might be helpful to the House to hear an update. But I think this morning we spoke about growth and jobs, and a good TTIP can deliver both growth and jobs for Europe and the European Union. That's why we should stick with the process, but also acknowledge that there are concerns around certain sectors that need to be acknowledged. You have given some reassurances on food safety standards, and I welcome that, but that must be copper fastened into any potential agreement. But on the beef sector, again, the issues are sensitive. Not so much around that particular point, because you've clarified the hormones issue, but around quantities and types of cuts that will be allowed in. If you're not careful there, you decimate Europe's beef production capacity, and that would be a step too far and a real concern for this House. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mrs. Sver has the floor.
Spoštovana predsedujoča, razmere v svetu so se do konca hladne vojne.
Madam President, the relations have changed since the Cold War. Russia has now got the old appetites back that it used to have, and China is asserting itself in the world, and other regions are becoming stronger in economic terms. So things have changed in the world. The United States and Europe are losing out on the world stage. They're losing out because they're democratic countries, and if we conclude this agreement, then I think we will get a lot of benefits, increase in the GDP, new jobs, and we will also get more democracy in the economy. And I think also the United States and the European Union will become more competitive. And we can also protect our interest in the area of consumer protection, for example, in the area of food safety. So therefore, we should have a strong relationship with the United States based on our shared values, and that way we're doing a good job for future generations.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Valian, please.
My colleagues, I choose to speak in favour of the TTIP this afternoon. TTIP is not and should not be just another free trade agreement. It is a historical milestone, as it will create a transatlantic market of opportunities for Europe and for the US. With two particular sectors I want to refer to, a common transatlantic approach to the digital economy, ICT and innovation will continue driving enormous productivity in our economy, encourage investments, while our creative and hyper-connected youth will be creating their own opportunities on the market. And second, an extended deal on energy trade within the TTIP will allow cheaper price for consumers, but also for our industry, making it more competitive on the world market, while we will ensure security of supply and therefore our independence. In today's world, we cannot afford to miss the opportunity. And as the proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.
Köszönöm képviselő asszony, következő hozzászólónk Kelly képviselő úr.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly has the floor.
I have listened to the debate from the outset, and I have listened with a certain amount of bemusement. Firstly, most people, while sharing various concerns regarding TTIP, are in favour of the process taking place. Others are against it from the outset. They seem to be against TTIP, I would say perhaps against the USA rather than TTIP per se. Why would you oppose the opportunity to create 2 million jobs in Europe, 0.5% of GDP and €550 per family per year? Yet this is what they want to do. We all have concerns regarding it, regarding agriculture, data protection, standards, etc. But that's what negotiation is all about. I say let the negotiations continue. Then we can make up our minds based on fact, not fiction, reality, not perception. Let's get on with it.
Köszönöm képviselő úr, következő hozzászólónk Herranz García.
Thank you very much. And now Mrs. Herranz García. Thank you, President, Commissioner. There's been a lot of talk here about all sorts of things, about SMEs, for example. There's one issue, and one sector hasn't been talked about, which is very important. That's the sector of the footwear industry. This employs a lot of SMEs in Europe. In order to, they want to sell in the United States, but they are paying high duties, and also for textiles as well. And sometimes there's up to 48% duty, and competitors in Mexico are not paying anything. So our rivals in Morocco are not paying any duties out of it. What does the US offer for our footwear products? They've proposed, has the Commission wanted to get rid of all duties for footwear? And what would the position of the Commission be on textiles, and in particular on footwear, in future negotiating rounds that are going to be opened as of now? Thank you very much.
Köszönöm képviselő asszony, most a hozzászóló...
Thank you very much. We've now come to the end of the debate, and we'll move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. There are 5 requests for the floor, and I'd ask colleagues to stick to their speaking time, just 1 minute each. Mr. Rosati.
Képviselő úr.
Commissioner, President, a comprehensive agreement on trade liberalisation between the EU and the US is urgently needed, given the growing competitive pressures coming from emerging new powers such as China and India. The planned opening of markets offers important economic benefits. The TTIP would increase GDP of both partners by about between 0.5 and 1% if implemented fully. The agreement would also make sense for political reasons, as it would consolidate the long-term strategic alliance between the EU and the US, which is necessary to confront new risks and challenges in the era of globalisation and international conflicts. We must not miss this unique opportunity. Removal of trade barriers is necessary to increase the competitiveness of European firms and to create new jobs in Europe. Of course, there are also risks involved. The level of protection in areas such as personal data protection or health and veterinary standards should not be reduced. Also, transition periods should apply in sectors where the US firms enjoy large competitive advantage. But on balance, this agreement deserves our support.
Következő hozzászólónk Szereó.
The speaker has been interrupted and Mr. Santos has the floor.
Please press micro.
Alô? Excelentíssimo representante da Comissão Europeia, excelentíssimo representante da Presidência do Conselho, caros colegas e caras colegas. Relativamente aos termos...
Madam President, on the TTIP, we should not have any naive ideas. There may well be advantages, but certainly also disadvantages. I know that there may be potential advantages, but what I'm concerned about is the potential losses, for example, in agriculture. The farmers of Europe should not become hostages to this agreement. There are dangers when we're talking about dairy products, for example. There, the United States are particularly competitive in prices.
And the tomato sector, for example, might suffer to such an extent that tomato production will be abandoned. And so I'd like to appeal to the Commission and strengthen this appeal so that it pays particular attention to the interests of European farmers in negotiation of the agreement with the United States, and so that it strikes the necessary balances in order to protect farming practices in Europe and farming activity in Europe, and in certain areas it's very difficult to replace this with another economic activity.
Hozzászólás Harkin képviselő asszony részéről történik.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Harkin is next.
Madam President, there are many positive and negative aspects to TTIP, but in my 1 minute I'll just deal with one issue. That is the inclusion of investor-state dispute settlements, or ISDS, in the agreement. ISDS are viewed with extreme concern by many citizens, including myself. In 2012, there were 62 cases were initiated, and in 2013, 57. This clearly indicates that the concerns of citizens and governments are well founded. In your response to a recent question, Commissioner, I submitted to you, you replied that genuine regulatory action cannot be successfully challenged. Surely, Commissioner, our competition and internal market rules should ensure genuine regulatory action by Member States. I believe that ISDS are not needed by two functioning and predictable legal systems. You also replied that any regulation passed in the public interest cannot be successfully challenged. But who is to decide what is in the public interest? An arbitration tribunal? Surely that's not acceptable. Concerns ranging from GMOs to fracking have been legitimately raised in the context of ISDS, and if the EU Commission ignores them, you run the risk of failure. The possibilities of TTIP are too important for that.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Harkin. Mr. Orteson, sorry.
Sí, comisario, gracias por su comparecencia.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for appearing here. We have the impression that the TTIP is a tightening of the screw, another failed policy. We seem to be incapable of getting a serious growth policy within the European Union, within the Eurozone, and now it seems that we're going to tighten the screw to this sort of liberalisation we've already seen, as if that was a solution to all problems. And this seems to be entirely the wrong focus. And moreover, I have to say that throughout this debate, you have claimed that through the TTIP there will be the liberalisation in all sorts of sectors within the European Union, but there has to be a public debate. If we want liberalisation in our sectors, then we wouldn't do that through the negotiation of a treaty behind the backs of all our peoples or in public. So this sort of agreement is not the solution, in our view, for the future of the European economy. And in any case, we need a future strategy that will help our citizens, help them to cope. We don't need failed international free trade treaties that we will end up footing the bill for over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kukan, please.
Ďakujem pekne, pani predsedajúca. Transatlantické vzťahy sa v súčasnosti pohybujú na veľmi tenkom.
Thank you very much, Madam President. the TTIP agreement, I believe, is one of the biggest challenges which face us. The Commission is going to have a new term, and this is our duty now to negotiate with our partners and our allies, and we must get a result which is a plus, brings advantages to both sides. The negotiations must be transparent. We need good communication channels with the citizens as well. The European Parliament will have the final say here, and you've got to listen to this Parliament. It cannot be an agreement at any cost. It's got to be a fair agreement on trade, one which ensures that we have safe food and that we've got protection for our personal information. We need that because that's what the voters wanted.
Now, in order to get a reply from the Commission, I'll give the floor now to Commissioner de Gucht. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. What shall I begin with after this very long debate, very rich one also? It seems to me that several debates are mixed up. This debate on whether or not you are in favour of trade. There is a debate on whether or not you consider the United States to be a fair partner. There is the debate whether or not negotiations are sufficiently transparent. Let me start with the first one, for or against trade. I realise after this debate, and I have to say also before the debate, that there are a number of members in this Parliament that I will never persuade that trade makes sense. I will never convince them, because we are against trade. So what can I change about it? I could reply with a question. Can you give me an example, be it by the far left or by the far right, that by the way has disappeared? They are not there anymore, they live in peace, of a country, of a society that has been able to develop without trade. If you give me some of those examples, then I am ready to discuss further with you. Secondly, the United States. I already mentioned in my introduction that this looks a little bit to me as a Kulturkampf, for or against the United States. I find this a rather strange debate, because obviously we differ on a number of issues with the United States, and personally myself as well. And I largely prefer the European way of life to the American way of life, but is that what it is about? I thought it was about trying to work together so that we can create jobs and growth in our own countries. I thought that was what it was about. I don't want to be the same as the United States in citizens, and most of them do not like to be as us Europeans either, or at least as some of us. It's about finding solutions together to grow, to have more impetus in our economy. That's what it is about. It's not about changing the American society, it's not changing about our society. We are different, we want to be different. But does it mean that we cannot work together? If we cannot work together with the United States, with whom then can we work together? They are different from us, but are all the rest then closer to us? Also the agreement with Canada has been mentioned today, which is in fact ready, apart from a couple of lines, and even not that. Also that agreement is now put into question. We have made an agreement with Singapore. Are we going to relinquish it? Last week we initialled the economic partnership agreement with ECOWAS, with the West of Africa. Can we still speak with them? Today the agreement, the EPA agreement with SADC has been initialled. Do we refuse to even discuss that because they are not the same as we are? I mean, what is the sense of that? I mean, it's about working together. It's not about identical. Please. Then there is a discussion on the transparency. There has never been conducted a trade agreement in as much transparency as this one. Never. Now, for a number of reasons. It's only since the Treaty of Lisbon that this Parliament has the competence to ratify agreements. So as long as you didn't have that competence, obviously that was different. And now we have to adapt to that new situation. But I would claim that we have been doing this with a lot of diligence. Our positions, the positions of the European Commission, you can read them on our website. If you read them all, you're going to spoil your summer holidays. You can be sure of that. Because it's thousands and thousands of pages. You know. We have, at the start of this Commission, we have agreed that all the documents we give to the Member States and to the European Council, we would also give them to the European Parliament. That has never happened before, you know. And again, with the TTIP negotiation, we have been doing that in a very diligent way. Now, there are, of course, a number of difficult problems in this. For example, the Council, and I'm pleased that they finally are present, the Council refuses to make the mandate public. I have asked that to... no, let me start even a little bit earlier. Madame Briggs, the former French Minister of Trade, has written me a letter some time ago saying, why don't you make the mandate public, you know? It was their mandate, it's not mine. I mean, it's a Council document. It's not a parliamentary document, you know. And again, in May we have had the discussion at my request with the Council, a very long request by discussion, by the way, to make the mandate public. Again, there was no majority for doing that. Now, it seems that finally they would come to the conclusion that maybe it's not so bad idea to make it public. By the way, everybody has it, you know. It's on the Internet. So what are you talking about? It's on the Internet. You are questioning me on the basis of text that you have, but that obviously you have not read, because if you had read those texts, you would see that we are not going to change the norms for the phytosanitary, for protection of the environment, for labour rights and whatsoever. It's explicitly in the mandate that you all have, or at least you should have read before starting in this debate. The problem of the reading rooms. I'm against reading rooms. I don't like that. But what is the problem in this? The problem in this is that the United States, that are also a big economy, they are also negotiating a lot of trade agreements, for example the Trans-Pacific Partnership with a lot of countries in Asia. And the way that they inform their members of parliament is by inviting them to a reading room, having the documents at their disposal. They can read them, they get information about it, they can ask questions about it, they cannot take copies, and they hope that they happily leave. I mean, that's the practice on the Hill in Washington. Now, you should understand from me that it's rather difficult to convince the Americans to give to us more than they give to their own members of parliament about their texts, you know, because our texts are known, our positions are known. It's about their positions. If they give us a document saying you can only make it available to your parliamentarians the way we make it available to our parliamentarians, I cannot change much about that. But can you call that secrecy? Can you call that secrecy? I mean, really, somebody who wants to follow what happens, I hope he doesn't and she doesn't get bored, that's something else, but you can amuse yourself every day with it, you know, and every day is something new about this. You must be, I mean, it must be fascinating probably, because so many people are interested in knowing something that doesn't still exist. Because everybody is against this agreement, to my knowledge, and normally I should know, there is no agreement yet. We have started the negotiations a year ago. We have 6 rounds of negotiations, the 6th one going on for the time being, by the way. We have had already 2 political stock takings. We are making progress on a number of issues, but we still have an enormous lot of difficulties with respect to market access, for example, where we say that we need much more market access for public procurement, much more, where we say that not all tariffs will disappear, that there will be a number of sensitive agricultural products where the tariffs will not as such disappear. Probably there will be a system with what they call TRQs, tariff-rated quotas, but we are not going to give that up, you know. We are not negotiating about lowering standards in these negotiations. For example, we are negotiating how we could make a number of regulations more compatible, sticking to the levels of protections that we presently have in the European Union. That's what we are doing, with a lot of time and effort, with tens of people continuously working on it. And yes, making progress, but also realizing that this will be a very difficult agreement, because we have a lot of offensive interests in this agreement, on everything, on market access, on tariffs, on services, on public procurement, on investment, on regulations. But we have also defensives on almost everything. You know, you should imagine that this is not the most comfortable position you can imagine when you are a negotiator. So these are difficult negotiations and we are working hard on it. But please, as a lot of members have been saying, at the end of the intervention we will judge upon the results. Don't forecast a result that I don't have the faintest idea about myself, you know, because we are in this process of negotiation. There has been a specific question, and maybe I should say something about it, about national parliaments. Will the national parliaments have to pronounce themselves on this? I think so, for a very simple reason, that this will be a mixed agreement. If it comes about, it will be a mixed agreement, and if it is a mixed agreement, then also national parliaments have to pronounce themselves. But we are not making those rules, you know. Read the Lisbon Treaty and you will see that for a pure trade agreement you only need the agreement, the ratification by the European Parliament. If it's mixed, it's also the national parliaments, and we live up to the rules that exist and that we respect. And yes, we will continue to make initiatives to get more transparency into the process. I can tell you that over the last months I have spoken, I don't know how many times exactly, but certainly more than 100 times about TTIP in all kinds of places that I have never been before. On ISDS, Madam President, now, please give me a little bit of time to respond to the about 50 interventions that have been made, because if not, afterwards they will say that I have not been transparent. So please, on ISDS, we got 150,000 replies on our consultation on ISDS. 150,000. That's a lot. But tens of thousands of these replies are identical, you know. Because, well, it's obvious that there are people in Europe that are very good in working with all these tools, you know. And obviously they have found a way not to get into the system and nevertheless introduce a reply. Normally you have to get into the system and then you have to read 12 questions and you have to answer 12 questions and then you have to send your reply. No, there has been found a way to circumvent this and giving replies without getting into the system, with as a result that tens of thousands of these replies are identical. So we will now analyse all this very scrupulously, qualitatively and quantitatively. So we will see what is in it. And once we have that, we will make a report on that. And once that report is ready, it will be at everybody's disposal. So first of all, at your disposal. And then we will discuss this with Member States in the Council of Ministers and with the European Parliament. And then the Commission, probably already the next one, will make up its mind what they will do with ISDS in the rest of the negotiation. That's the process that we will follow. It will take time, it will take a lot of time, and I think some officials in the Commission can forget about their summer holidays. Let me just tackle one more issue that has been mentioned and that is very interesting, I believe, for the climate in which all this is happening. That's the GIs. We get attacked because maybe GIs will not be protected, and this would be terrible. By the way, this European Commission has been doing more than anybody else to protect GIs. In all the agreements that we have been concluding, Canada, Singapore, again now in the EPAs, there is a full protection of GIs. So we have really fostered that idea. Now, whatever we get in this agreement with the United States on GIs, it will be more than we presently have. Do not start from the assumption that presently the GIs are protected in the United States. What we try to do is protect them in the United States, and we will make sure that that happens. But presently this is not the case. So you should rather be in favour of TTIP if you are for the protection of GIs. Now let me finish, Madam President, because I see that you are going to interrupt me very soon, and I even have a lot of understanding for that. Let's try to be a little bit more rational in this whole discussion. I have participated in not in an active way in the European elections, in a passive way. And I'm very happy, I have to say, that today, finally, I can also participate in an active election campaign meeting. But that's what the Parliament is for. Now, what the Parliament is also for is looking at the arguments, listening to the arguments, and discuss on the basis of arguments. And then, of course, in all freedom, in full sovereignty, vote on what the Commission finally, sooner or later, will propose to you. Thank you very much.
Commissioner, thank you very much for such a detailed response. And now we'll move on, if you are agreeable, to the next item. But before that, yesterday, in line of Rule 231, paragraph 4, there were no requests to vote on any of the core agenda that were announced yesterday afternoon at 5, and so the core agenda are now deemed approved. So now I'll move on to Council and Commission statements on the withdrawal of the Maternity Leave Directive. And I'll give the floor, first of all, to the representative of Council, the Under-Secretary. You have the floor. Thank you, Madam President. Honourable members, the Council believes that the directive that we are discussing, that is from 1992, is an integral part of legislation on safety and health at work, and we believe that this is a very important directive. And what we need is to update the directive from various points of view. That's why the Council has made this into one of its priorities as of 2008, when the Commission put forward its proposal, and the European Parliament as well, given the importance of the issue, has done some very important work. The negotiations in Council have been major negotiations, but also difficult negotiations, tricky negotiations, because of the big gap between the positions in the Council and the big gap when it came to the positions of the Council and the European Parliament. So what are the biggest points of difficulty? Well, there were substantive differences between the national social legislation in the area, and very big substantive differences between national legislation. There's a great deal of diversity between national social security systems and social legislation systems. And then there were differences of opinion over costs. And you shouldn't underestimate these difficulties in general terms. You shouldn't underestimate this either in times when we have a great deal of pressure on public budgets. And there were also difficulties when it came to subsidiarity. and because of traditions and because of very different practices prevailing in various member states. And as regards the substantive differences, I could just give you a couple of examples. The topic of the duration and the timetable for the obligatory leave. There are big differences between the member states and very different points of view separating the member states on the length of maternity leave in the Council. And as regards costs, that no agreement was possible, and I think it's very difficult, and it would be very difficult in future negotiations if at the request of the European Parliament we try to get a minimum of 20 weeks for maternity leave. There was a great deal of discussion, in-depth discussion, but there was no agreement achieved in Council on this request from the European Parliament for a minimum of 20 weeks maternity leave. And on that subsidiarity, to give you an example, some member states raised the issue that some standards covered by the draft legislation is already covered by national laws. For example, breastfeeding time, and then special working arrangements for parents of disabled children, or extra maternity leave in certain cases. And the Council felt that the detailed provisions, including the implementing measures for minimum standards, were matters really for the competence and the sovereignty of the Member States. And in case the Member States did repeat their commitment in order to enhance health and safety of pregnant women and for those who have given birth and who are breastfeeding. And there is a general acknowledgement in the Council of the importance of reconciling working life and home life. And when it comes to the improvement of the present standards in the areas of protection of workers and employees who are pregnant, and creating a better balance between working life and private life, there, I think, colleagues, we still have to find the appropriate tools and the right political sector. I think it would be difficult for the Council to accept such proposals from the European Parliament in the context of legislation on health and safety. However, that doesn't in any case call into question the very useful contribution that's been made by the European Parliament to the debate on this subject. President, honourable members, I've just summed up the various discussions in my presentation, and I say that there were big differences of opinion, substantive differences of opinion, differences between the position in Council and the position in Parliament in the first reading. And in the light of these big contradictions, these big differences of views, it's in the light of all this that the Commission drew the conclusion and also had to take into account the possibility of withdrawing its proposal. Now, certainly, of course, this is a prerogative which the treaties grant to the Commission. The Commission, at any point in time, has the possibility of tabling proposals and withdrawing proposals. These are institutional powers and competences of the Commission, and only the Commission that can act in this way. And there are deliberations also relating to the smooth functioning of lawmaking procedure, and this is part of the refit. The refit process is also part of the Commission's toolbox. And then, of course, there are political assessments, and this is what I want to talk about.